and welcome to the Houghton Library at Harvard. I'm in Harvard today because this is where, I'm losing my accent. So I'm at Harvard today because this is where John Rawls worked for 40 years of his life. He was, of course, not entirely Harvard educated himself. He went to Princeton, part of the American aristocracy, as it were. But perhaps it was at these elite institutions. My accent comes and goes with whether I have the pipe in my mouth. But it turns out that perhaps with this elite education came a sense of Aristotelian duty. Noblesse oblige, possibly. If you remember that was the obligation of the nobles to the other people because they'd been lucky enough to become noble themselves, and so they owed back to the other people. So noblesse oblige, possibly, that led him to divert from the Lockean emphasis upon private property alone as the fundamental right of the liberal tradition. I've got my accent going despite the pipe being out of my mouth. I don't actually know what accent it is, but in any case. Okay, so I'm not actually going to hang around at Harvard for very long. I guess we'll just chuck the pipe. All right, so what's happened in between Marx and John Rawls? Let's go over some of that. But it's so hot with the scarf and the ascot thing that I got. Oh God. Okay. All right. It's more comfortable. Ready to go. Okay, so what's happened between Karl Marx and John Rawls? Well, Marx actually had a brief moment in the sun in the mid-1800s where there were a series of uprisings across Europe that were people's uprisings, and that Marx actually thought that were in fact the kinds of revolutions that he had foreseen coming in the future. And so he went to these places and tried to organize them and was behind a lot of efforts. But what he hadn't seen was that right-wing leaders, kind of authoritarian government leaders, that were able to put down most of those revolutions in a fairly short amount of time. But as you moved into the 1900s, there continued to be these rumblings from developing industrial society where people wanted to rise up and claim more power in their own societies for the popular will and against the elite who were coming up. And actually the one place where a revolution got off the ground was, of course, in Russia. But that wasn't exactly what Marx would have thought, because they overthrew a czar, which was not exactly a capitalist leader. It was more tied into the aristocracy and the monarchy. But in any case, we're going to focus more on the United States now, because that's where we're headed. Rawls is not the first person for the United States that we've focused on as of yet. We had Frederick Douglass, who was fighting against slavery, of course. But at this point, reflecting the rise of American power in the world, we'll be focusing mostly on Americans moving forward. So, what happened in America? Well, in the early 1900s, America was coming out of the period of the Gilded Age, and where there had been the robber barons, these people who were in charge of society, perhaps the bourgeoisie par excellence, those people like Carnegie and Rockefeller and all of those champions of industry. And eventually that also came to be challenged by the popular will in America. And as a matter of fact, throughout the early 1900s, a lot of people were worried about a kind of communist rebellion or something like that in the United States. And so how did the United States avoid having a popular rebellion? Well, there's a number of things that happened, and they ended up being moderating steps that moderated the free market economy in the United States. So for instance, you had Teddy Roosevelt, who became president, and he decided that you ought to keep back public land so that you could have public parks in order for the populace to be able to experience nature and have more fulfilling lives. and he fought against trusts, and so you had this big trust busting period. So a trust was basically a huge company that came to dominate the market in any one area and allow for growth independent of competition with them. But even after that, many of the Marxists in the United States, and there was the whole Marxist party in the United States, and Eugene Debs ran for president and got not an insignificant representation of the populace to vote for him on the communist ticket. But there were communists, and they weren't entirely happy yet about the changes that had been done. And further things were done, like limitation of child labor and the establishment of basically an 8-hour work day, and then you had to pay overtime to people. And so basically there were a set of structures that came in and tried to mitigate against the overwhelming power of the bourgeoisie or the owner class in the United States. But most of that still didn't really appease those who were Marxists, and they continued to think that there was going to be a great uprising. So what changed here? Well, for the most part, it was the coming of the Great Depression and then the reaction to that from the United States government. So with the Great Depression, basically the economy fell out after a period of kind of libertarian rulership of the United States, which had moved back towards free market economics. And in this crushed economy, there was a new president, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who came to power. And he put forward the idea of what came to be called the welfare state in his idea of the New Deal for people. And so he established a set of controls inside the economy, things like Social Security and Medicaid and food stamps, and he even started projects that the government would put people to work when the economy wasn't running very well, so that you got public works projects and investment in public art. This was not what the communists thought they were going to get. They wanted an uprising that would throw out the bourgeoisie and would, in fact, entirely transform the world away from private property. But some Marxists of the time actually looked at the development of the welfare state and ended up saying, you know what, this brings me back on board with the liberal program. Because if the liberal program can, in fact, at the same time provide for people's needs and provide a safety net for people and allow a kind of market economy to keep going, then that seems like a good idea, especially with what was happening over in Russia, where there was like authoritarian government, mass murder, and all of this stuff. So there was a time in America when there was a possible communist faction, but it was pretty much put down not by a radical form of capitalism that defeated it, but by Franklin Delano Roosevelt finding a kind of middle space between capitalism, the absolute free market, and communism, trying to actually address the needs, especially of poor people. And the welfare state actually was the dominant form of thought about government in the United States from about the 1940s until the end of the 1970s. So it had a significant period when it was the dominant way that Americans thought. But the welfare state didn't actually address all of the problems that were going on. So the picture now behind me is one that contrasts a significant amount of what was going on. On the one hand, the United States could claim the world's highest standard of living, and there you see the picture with the nice white family gaining things. But it wasn't true that actually black people were moving ahead as quickly. And in the South, after the Civil War, there was a period of Reconstruction, but it never actually took hold. It was kind of imposed upon the South for a number of years, and then eventually it became politically untenable, and the northern states pulled back their forces, and they allowed the southern states to do what they wanted. And this led to a period when authorities figured out ways to cut blacks off from their ability to vote by establishing things like poll taxes and all sorts of ways that they weren't exactly saying, no, you don't have a right to vote, but in practice they found ways to make sure that blacks didn't vote. And so in the South, a number of largely white people took back control, and that's eventually why we had to have the civil rights movement, and coming on to today, we're still dealing with the ramifications of that. There were also continuing problems with women's rights. I don't know, but women didn't get the right to vote until so frickin' late in the United States. And even when they got that, there still tended to be other questions of the structures of American society that held women in place. So for instance, early on, people thought about women's jobs and men's jobs, and people still do this kind of thing, where they thought, okay, so most people who are elementary school teachers and even high school teachers, right, you'll find that they're females. Whereas if you go into college, the number of professors are majority male, part of the structure of our society and part of the patriarchal structure of our society. So while the welfare state approached the issues of economic equality, there were continuing issues of equality that had been raised by other structural questions in the society. Philosophy was a little bit late getting to these developments. As a matter of fact, the supreme figure arguing for something like the welfare state, or in fact beyond the welfare state, was John Rawls, who actually landed his punches in favor of his argument at the end of the period of the welfare state. But Rawls was also sensitive to other kinds of inequalities. And he marshaled the liberal tradition of philosophy to try and get it to address all of these issues, which had kind of fallen out in the process of a too consistent focus on individual rights to life, liberty, and property, which then didn't approach the social issues that were going on in the country because it was a little bit too individualistic. Now, saying that Rawls showed up late in the development of that middle position, an alternative to both Marxism on the one side and capitalism or maybe absolute utilitarianism on the other side, right, is not to say that he isn't important. As a matter of fact, Rawls is the most important political philosopher of the last 100 years easily. And as a matter of fact, he obtains a kind of place much like John Locke did, where everybody who comes after him, right, has to argue with him. Even if you disagree with him, you've got to figure out, well, how do you react to what Rawls thought? So let's start with an account of what Rawls thought of the particular accounts of justice that were on the table when he started. So, for instance, we could look back at the utilitarian account of justice, which aimed at the greatest net pleasure for the society, or as that got cashed out in economics, the greatest overall amount of production. Well, is that a good way of figuring out the overall welfare, the overall justice of the society? Well, I mean, in some ways, you could look at this and you could say, you know what, the United States has been doing really well in terms of welfare. Everything's been going incredibly well. The United States is becoming more and more just over time if GDP and production is all that you look at. But actually, things become a little bit more complicated if you look at the way that that is distributed in the society. And you remember that we said that this was one of the weaknesses of utilitarianism, at least if you think that you ought to pay attention to distribution, it's a weakness, because utilitarianism didn't have any concern for fairness or equality of distribution. And so you can look at the rise in GDP and see how, as a matter of fact, it was a particular group of the society that were getting ahead on the basis of this. So lots of people complain today about the 1%, and what does that mean? Well, you can see in this chart, like it's the 1% that actually gained from the rise in GDP the most. And as you go down the economic ladder, you find that other people didn't gain as much with the rise of GDP. This is especially since Rawls's work, as I say, Rawls came about in the 1970s, but it shows you some of the problems with only paying attention to production. Or if you want another way of breaking this down, you could look at the distribution in terms of different races. Who is it that in fact is getting ahead, or is anybody getting ahead in this process? And if you look at it, if you break down the distribution of increase in terms of race, you find out that, as a matter of fact, racial categories have, for the most part, stayed in similar relation to each other. We don't have a society that's gaining greater equality, or that races are actually coming closer to each other. None of that is happening. So in Rawls's picture, there seems to be a problem here. If we just focus on production, we don't focus on distribution, we don't focus on how fair the system is for anybody else. Okay, let's talk about the problems with Marxism. Now, one is that in Marxism, the government takes over the economy, and so they control prices and how much of any particular thing gets produced. This means that there's not a free market where people are just free to buy what they want, and this can tell the people who are making the products how much they should produce. And so there's no signaling of what people's preferences are at any given time. And this means that the Marxist economy is inefficient, because you end up producing a lot of goods that actually people don't want that much, because you have no great way of figuring out what it is that people actually prefer at any given time. The other is also tied to the problem of a lack of market economy, because, well, Marx thought that when you got rid of private property, you would get rid of greed and competitiveness, and people would be incentivized, motivated to work on the basis of their desire to create. But it turns out that this doesn't work out that well. And so there's a problem incentivizing people to work. Now, I don't want to overdo the impact of this. The GDP of the Soviet Union did in fact increase throughout most of the Soviet period. So it wasn't like people weren't motivated at all to produce things. They did produce things. But if you look at a comparison of the Soviet Union versus the United States in terms of the amount that they produce, you'll note that the Soviet Union was closer to a flat line than the United States was. The United States GDP was, in fact, kind of rocketing up at the same time that the Soviet Union was going down. And you'll note that this is mostly over the period that the welfare state actually ruled in the United States. So the welfare state didn't slow things down, at least as much as communism did in terms of providing growth. There was this kind of middle effort in the United States. So Rawls sets about then thinking about things like utilitarianism and the utilitarian account of justice, and the Marxism and the Marxist account of justice. Rawls didn't even think it was really an account of justice. He thought it was a principle beyond justice when he thought about it. But in any case, when he looked at those two alternatives, he said, well, there's got to be a way to find a just alternative to these. We need to have some philosophical basis for something that goes in between these two options. So where do we start? Well, he says, let's go back to the liberal tradition. So the social contract tradition, basically going back to Hobbes and to Locke. And in an interesting way, he's actually going to mix together a little bit of Hobbes and a little bit of Locke. But for the most part, he starts out kind of like Locke does. So he starts out able to talk about the importance of the individual internal to a scheme of justice. Each person possesses an inviolability founded on justice that even the welfare of society as a whole cannot override. For this reason, justice denies that the loss of freedom for some is made right by a greater good shared by others. It does not allow that the sacrifices imposed on a few are outweighed by the larger sum of the advantages enjoyed by the many. The rights secured by justice are not subject to political bargaining or the calculus of social interests. Doesn't that sound nice and liberal, individualistic? Like individuals have rights and you can't take these away, no matter what. Even utilitarianism is wrong on these grounds, and thinking that maybe the overall happiness of the society could in fact come and allow the taking away of those rights. There is one difference that you might want to note here, however. It's a difference from from Locke, and this might be important as we go forward. The inviolability of people, that is the absolute dignity, importance, and the rights of the individual, for Rawls are founded on justice, not the other way around. So the account of the dignity and inviolability of the person come out of an account of what is just overall. This actually runs backwards from what Locke thought. So he thought that in the state of nature, we don't really have a developed account of justice other than what's given to us through the natural law. And the natural law tells us about our own individual rights. So, as a matter of fact, we develop an account of justice as we try and work out what is our relation to each other, given that we have these individual rights. So for Locke, individual rights come first, and then you figure out an account of justice. For Rawls, let's start with justice first, and then this allows you to come to an account of the inviolability of individual persons. So this is a significant difference between the two, and I'm going to show you why it is that that comes about, as Rawls doesn't have a state of nature that he thinks you actually start in as individuals. So this starts us out on some of the problems that there are with the social contract tradition that Rawls wants to address if he's going to rejuvenate it and make it palatable for a new period of history. I mean, number one is the basic one that we've talked about several times, like, when did I sign on to the social contract? If, as a matter of fact, individuals are so important as you say we are, shouldn't we have a kind of right to veto? But nobody's ever given a really good answer to that. Another problem is this, that if you really think carefully about contracts and when contracts are valid, well, we think that contracts are valid when they're made between people with roughly equal power to each other and equal knowledge to each other. So usually if you're going to go and you're going to buy a car, right, what you need to do is you need to go and bulk up, go search the internet, find out prices and like how cars work and know something about cars before you go into it, because in order to get a good contract, one that actually represents your own interests, you want to be on equal footing with the person who's selling you the car. And as a matter of fact, if the imbalance of power gets to be too great, we don't even allow people to enter into contracts with each other. So if there's an adult and they make a contract with a child, we say, no, your intellectual powers are actually too different from each other so that you can't make a contract with each other. You've got to be equal, at least somewhat, with each other. Well, the social contract, by the time we get it in Locke's system, seems to be made by a group of people who have made a significant amount of money and everybody else. And I pointed this out as we went through Locke with the question of whether it was in fact the bourgeoisie, those kind of upper class owners of society, that made the social contract, or whether it was generally everybody who made the social contract. So is the contract actually a legitimate contract? Has it been made by parties that are roughly equal in their powers so that they could strike a good contract? Here we actually see a problem that emerges between Hobbes and Locke, because Hobbes at least posited that everybody in the state of nature had equal power to each other, at least in the sense everybody had an equal power to kill each other. So it seems like, in some sense, Hobbes's contract actually is more valid than Locke's, because Locke recognizes that people don't actually have equal powers to each other. And so we end up with the question, should they ever have been signing off on a contract at all? Well, if we enter into a contract where people know their own powers and are able to use them in the contract, says Rawls, people being self-interested, rational but self-interested people, here he kind of agrees with Hobbes, as opposed to Locke. Locke might have thought we were just too rational for all of this. But being self-interested people, they would tend to abuse the system. They would tend to go for rules of the society that favor themselves. And in order to fill this out, I'm going to show you a commercial, which is not because I'm selling cellular. It's actually way too old. I don't think anybody has cellular minutes. But this is a good example of the ways that if people had the power, they would define the rules of the society in their own favor, even when they're trying to make it look like they're establishing universal rules of justice.
Dad, listen, we're gonna go broke unless we figure out a way to divvy up the shared data plan fairly. So, whoever's fathered the most children gets the most data.
Let's just do it by hair.
Body hair?
Most dental work.
What? Stop downloading and stop liking everything. It should be by who has the least amount of cartilage in their left knee.
Just want to take a bath.
Say no to sharing. Say yes to Sprint. With truly unlimited data, text, and calling.
Okay, so in that commercial, we see how each member of the family, in trying to come up with what they are going to say are impartial rules, attempts to say, okay, but the person who decides on the rules should be the person that, and then they name some quality that they have. So you can imagine, going back into the past, the aristocrats of society would say, oh, well, the rules of society should be made by the people who are most educated, because, of course, the aristocrats were the most educated. And Rawls says this is exactly what we should expect, because what self-interested individuals will do is claim systems that put themselves in control, even if they do this in the name of some objective good. And this isn't just a theoretical problem, says Rawls, because original inequality is a fact. So on this, Locke was right. There is, in fact, original inequality, and this comes in the form of what Rawls calls natural and social lotteries. So a natural lottery has to do with yourself, your genetics maybe, the pheromones that made you, or whatever it is that made you. I'm not a biologist. So what made you tall, or what made you short? Or what gave you a naturally increased intellectual capacity, or what made you a more coordinated people than other people are? So there are a range of natural lotteries which in fact put us in different positions, and this can go on. Actually, really sad story. Rawls himself might have been sensitized to the role of kind of luck in moral life. When he was a child, he had two brothers who both died because of diseases that they contracted from him. And this was at different times, right? I mean, he got diphtheria at one point, and one of his brothers came into his room, caught the disease, and died. And then at another time, I think it was influenza that he got, and his other brother contracted it and died. And Rawls, looking around, says, you know what? Like, equality is not something that's just built into the world, that we're naturally going to get equal amounts or goods. This is something that comes, it's like a lottery. You don't deserve what you get, and that idea is going to be important too as we go. So there's also social lotteries. So not just the physical characteristics that you're born with, but a whole set of other things, like, are you born to a loving and nurturing family? Are you born to a wealthy family or a poor family? Are you born into a particular race which is treated different in social terms, or occupies a different place in those charts that we saw before, where economic wealth is spread out differently depending upon your particular race? What religion are you, and what's the dominant religion in society? What gender are you, and how does that shape your earnings for your future, etc.? So Rawls says all these things are products of lotteries, or maybe, to pick a better metaphor, all of these things are outcomes of a flip of a coin. So in a lottery, you might think, well, the person who wins the lottery deserves it because they went and they bought the ticket, and, you know, they took the chance, and so they bring it in. But in this case, these aren't even lotteries in that sense. It's just random chance that anybody is born to a particular family, or tall or short, at least the way that Rawls thinks about it. It's just accident. So for Rawls, people do not deserve their own strengths and weaknesses that come from these sources. It's not a product of their character. It's not a reflection of virtue. It doesn't say anything about whether they're inherently good or bad. But these things set the stage for the rest of all of our lives. And if we were to imagine people getting into a social contract, well, they would start out unequal. And so they wouldn't be able to strike a just contract from the beginning. So how are you going to take care of all of these problems with this social contract, at least from the tradition that we've received? Well, Rawls says, okay, we need to start out from a different place. If we haven't actually been able to negotiate the social contract from an equal starting place before, maybe we can if we try a particular trick. So he suggests that we try a kind of thought experiment. The social contract, he says, is the agreement that rational people would make from a position of original equality. This will be the original position, people call it in Rawls' system. So we know that the social contract is the agreement that we would make if we were in a situation of equality, but we also know that we're not in a situation of equality. So how do you get to this impossible situation of equality given that we don't live there? Well, Rawls suggested that what we ought to do is trick ourselves. So imagine this. There's a curtain, a veil that you can go behind, but when you go behind this veil, you'll forget everything particular about yourself, and all that'll be left of your knowledge about yourself is just that you're a human being. So we're going to get rid of everything that's particular about you, whether I'm a male, I'm a female, whether I'm black, whether I'm white, whether I'm Christian, whether I'm Muslim, whether I like blue, whether I like green, whether I have glasses, whether I don't have glasses, right? And we're going to go behind this, and all that's going to be left is a rational human being that then has to figure out what justice should look like. Another way to put this is to say that, imagine that behind the veil of ignorance where you've forgotten everything about yourself and just become the basic, vanilla, rational human being, then you look back out and you can see society in front of you with all of the particularities, all of the people who are tall, short, white, black, male, female, whatever religion, whatever, all of these differences between them. But you don't know who you're gonna be when you enter back into society. When you come back out from behind the veil of ignorance, you know that you're gonna be one of these people, but you don't know which one you're gonna be. Well, if you forget who you are, says Rawls, if you adopt this kind of stripped down picture of yourself, then you'll be able to think. You'll think still like a self-interested, rational person, but you'll be able to come to decisions that are not particularly biased because you'll be thinking about yourself as a kind of every person, or thinking about what would be if you were in any of these particular positions. So let's take a look at this and think about how you might think. So as a class in ethics and leadership, imagine that I go around and I give out a series of pieces of paper. And these pieces of paper have numbers. Some have 1 on them, some have 2 on them, some have 3 on them, some have 4 on them, right? Or let's jump one up to 5, just go crazy, right? And I give everybody slips of paper. Or some people I give 1 slip of paper, some people I give 2 slips of paper, some people I give 3 slips of paper. So you can imagine that there are some people who got 1 slip of paper and they have like 1 on their card. There are some people who got 3 slips of paper. Now the chances of getting a set of 3 5s is pretty ridiculous, but you could have like a significant amount, right? Once I've done that, I say, okay, this is the basis of your grade for the class. So you look down and you look at your 1 and you're like, okay, what does this mean? And I say, well, the overall is out of 4. So, what you have, that's your grade out of 4. So the person who's got like 1 is sitting there thinking, oh my goodness, I just flunked this class by getting this piece of paper, right? And then I say, okay, so you can choose, you know, what you want. You can trade off with somebody else, but there's a special condition here that if you end up with more than 100% in the class, I'll allow you to apply that to a different class, like maybe one that you're having trouble in, right? So you can use extra points across classes. So this will be fun, right? Well, then you look around and you're like, okay, I'm the person with one. Does anybody want to trade with me? What are the chances? So imagine you're the person with 15. Would you want to trade, or would you decide that you want to use that for another class that you're in and hold on to those points? Even though you know that some people are going to be flunking this class because of the slip that they got. Well, Rawls says, and every time I actually do this in a class, it works out, that the majority of people getting over the 100% will actually hold on to it. They won't share. They won't actually tell anybody else that they have the majority of points, but they'll hold on to it. Some people share, but not everybody and not the majority of people. But imagine that before I handed out the slips, I then said, okay, you've got to make the rules for how you're going to trade around points once I hand out the slips. What kind of rules would you set up for the society of the classroom? What would you set up for everybody to do? And different people come up with different rules. Do you set kind of a minimum? You say, okay, so we'll make sure everybody at least has to get 3 points. Right? If we distribute it, everybody's got to get 3 points, but then above that, different people can have different amount of points. But as long as everybody makes it to a C. Or do you go for like an egalitarian? You say, no, what we should do is just spread evenly. As close to even as possible, we should spread those points throughout the society. Or do you go more of a Marxist route where you're like, you know what, the people who are in the most need, like the people who have the worst grade point average, we should give them the most points because they can spread it around to their whole system of classes, right? So what are the kind of standards that you set for the society? Well, Rawls says that it's the second scenario where you don't know the number of points that you have when you ought to start thinking about justice. If you forget all the particulars of your advantages and your disadvantages, then is when you ought to start thinking about justice. Or to give a different example of this, imagine that I have a child who's scooping out ice cream, right? And they know which bowl is theirs and they know which bowl is their sister's or brother's, right? And so if they know which bowl is theirs, well, what will they tend to do? Will they tend to give themselves more ice cream than their brother or sister gets, right? Yeah, I mean, this tends to happen. So if you actually want to solve for this problem, don't let them know whose bowl is whose. And say, so at the end, we're going to figure out whose bowl is whose. And their tendency will, in fact, to produce equal or more equal bowls of ice cream because they don't know which one they're going to get. So this gets us to the picture of Rawls' veil of ignorance, where if we step behind, we forget about our own advantages and disadvantages. We forget about which part of it we get and other people get, and then, says Rawls, we're ready to start thinking about justice. And that's actually the way to found the social contract, because this puts justice before the individual. You see, the individual actually knows about themselves as an individual, you see. Whereas for Rawls, the appropriate starting point is where you actually don't know about yourself and your particularities. So justice comes before the individual, even though Rawls thinks that from behind the veil of ignorance, as kind of stripped down rational people, we would then say, no, individuals ought to have rights. There ought to be standards that we treat every person with. Every person ought to be treated with dignity. Because I don't know which one of those people I'm going to be when I get out there. I want all of them treated with a base amount of dignity and rights. Okay, so that's my first lecture on Rawls. I've gotten you behind the veil of ignorance now, and it's from there that we're going to start thinking about justice. So I've only actually said a little bit about Rawls' theory of justice. All of this has been said about how to get you into the position where you can appropriately think about justice from within the revised liberal tradition. We're renegotiating the social contract as rational individuals of equal powers, or we're trying to do that with a thought experiment anyway. Okay, so that said, I'll come back in a few minutes with my second lecture on Rawls.